Thanks to everyone again for joining us today. I know I see many of the faces have been here as I have since the morning, and lots of interesting themes have come up again and again. And in the first panel, we heard from people from Penang, Lo Lim, Lin Lee, as well as Jessica Chen from Montreal. And something came up very quickly, I think, which was really, where's Vancouver Chinatown in the context of other Chinatowns, around North America and around the world? Some of the challenges that are being faced that came up very quickly in discussion this morning. And so we're really happy to have in this panel actually something more explicitly tying and connecting Vancouver Chinatown and what's going on here with other Chinatowns, including Montreal, Toronto, San Francisco, and some of the broader challenges. And so we have some speakers here. I'll actually quickly introduce them and pass on to them to share. And so if you want to know more, please look online at Chinatown Reimagined for their full bios. But rather than spending the time introducing each one and repeating what's in those bios, I encourage everyone to go, perhaps even while you're listening, to the bios themselves and find out more about our speakers. But first, I want to pass it very quickly on to our first speaker, Karen Cho, a filmmaker who's making films right now, a film right now about Chinatowns in North America. And so she's grew up and is still living in Montreal. And so she's going to talk a little bit about her work in Montreal. Karen.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Just give me maybe a thumbs up if it's working. Okay, so hi, everyone. I'm Karen, as Henry said. I'm from Montreal, or Jojoge. I'm a volunteer with the Chinatown Working Group, but I'm also a documentary filmmaker. So I am making a film right now on endangered Chinatowns. So first off, I'm from Montreal. We're kind of the Chinatown that's known for having 4 gates. Our Chinatown Working Group actually started in 2019, and it was because some of our members actually noticed 2 condo projects were breaking ground right beside our South Gate. There was also concerns about the loss of our cultural center and other kind of gentrification pressures. So we engaged with the city in this kind of consultation process around the Chinatown. But things really came to a head in April of this year. And that was when Jean-Philippe Riotel, who's the gentleman in the green vest here, he's a longtime resident of our Chinatown and a tenant. He broke the news that Wings Noodles, which is our oldest operating business in our Chinatown, that they had sold their buildings to a developer, and that the developer was amalgamating the properties on the Wings block, which is the oldest, most historic block in our Chinatown. So the Wings block, if my slide will change, sorry. Okay, the Wings block is our most historic block. It's got buildings that date back to the 1820s. The block basically tells the story of the settlement of Montreal itself. People from the Irish, Jewish, French, Scottish, English, and Chinese communities all moved through this block or coexisted on the block. So when news of the assembly of the block broke, CWG went public with our demands. And within the period of about a month, we onboarded about 70 volunteers. So I'm going to play a video right now that kind of will give you a sense of what has been and is happening in our Chinatown.
house that we built.
We're all united because of the urgency of the situation.
So, I mean, it goes without saying it has been a crazy year in Montreal's Chinatown. But in this kind of short period of time, the CWG, we've managed to get the city and province to engage in a process for heritage designation and protection of our Chinatown. We've pushed for interim measures to address ongoing development. The city has committed to putting a social housing unit on Clark Street, which was the kind of abandoned street you saw in the video. And we've also managed to set up a Chinatown roundtable that's going to act as a kind of official mechanism of communication between the city and the community. So there have been some wins, but we have a lot of challenges. So my work as a filmmaker, I've spent the past like year and a half almost filming in 4 different Chinatowns. So I've been shooting in Montreal, New York, Toronto, and Vancouver. And in a way, the fact that I've been kind of in contact with these different Chinatowns, I've managed to have a more zoomed out perspective on what has been going on in so many Chinatowns. And this kind of really speaks to that question about, you know, should we engage nationally or get into, you know, discussions and collaborate with other Chinatowns and other groups, you know, to learn best practices and tactics. So for me on the ground, what I have been noticing, you know, certain patterns and trends that seem to be happening in so many of our Chinatowns. Sorry, my slideshow. So one thing is you know, this kind of intersection of racism and urban renewal and how that's really played into the destruction of the Chinatowns. I think like every major urban Chinatown in North America has had a freeway run through it or fought a freeway going through it. You know, major public infrastructure projects, stadiums, government buildings have all been dropped on our Chinatowns or displaced our Chinatowns. And, you know, the city maps have also been weaponized against Chinatown, you know, characterizing the Chinatown as a slum, fit for removal. But even today, you know, we kind of see this pattern continuing, you know, be it with the light rail in Edmonton, this public toilet they tried to put in Montreal, and the 40-story jail that's slated for Manhattan's Chinatown. There's this kind of recurring pattern of putting all these major urban projects into Chinatown with little regard or consultation with the community. Another thing, you know, I'm noticing is obviously like the active erasure of the history and the presence of the Chinatown, especially for the Chinatowns like Montreal's that do not have any heritage designation. So the kind of dark photo in the corner is of the one VJ condo project that's going up. It's a luxury condo going up in Montreal. The white text is how they describe where they're located on their website. Without making any reference whatsoever to Chinatown. And the photo beside is where the building is going to be, very much inside of Chinatown. So it's really disturbing to see these developers basically write Chinatown off the map in their rhetoric. We're seeing similarities with Edmonton, parts of Edmonton being renamed. And even if you like Google Vancouver Chinatown, it literally doesn't show up on the Google map. Another thing I've noticed is this kind of use of Chinatown as a marketing backdrop for all these kind of like new and hip businesses that are coming into the Chinatowns. There are tons of examples of this, but the one that hit really close to home for me is the one in Montreal. It's the pink building in the corner. And I actually met the owner of this business like on a shoot in Montreal's Chinatown. And he told me, oh, you know, I've just opened up this new tapas bar in Chinatown. It's in the pink building. And for the life of me, I was like, what, where's this new business? Like, and then I finally realized it was this building, this pink building here, which is one of our most historic buildings. It's on the Wings block. And it's actually a building that I have grown up going to my whole life. It used to house a restaurant called The Crown that our family loved. And when my grandmother died, we actually bought the envelopes for her funeral at this what was a store called Fleurs et Cadeaux, which means flowers and gifts. And it was obviously a store that sold products for Chinese funerals. So it was just really upsetting to me to know that this kind of tapas bar had taken over and appropriated this sign for the business. In a way, it camouflages the gentrification that was happening in the neighborhood, because the outside of the building looked completely the same. And this kind of thing of like new businesses like appropriating the signs of like old businesses is happening in several of the Chinatowns. Another example is like Chinese tuxedo. In the New York's Chinatown, their Instagram feed is full of photos of the seniors in Columbus Park, used to hawk these kind of like really expensive cocktails named Geisha and Dragon and whatnot. And of course, there's the Sai Wu in Vancouver. And when I first saw Sai Wu, I thought it was like the Ho-Hos or the Chinatown barbecue. I was like really excited for this place. But I quickly found out from people on the ground in Vancouver that this restaurant actually has no connection whatsoever to the community and is actually using artifacts from the community as decor. So, another trend is obviously like using Chinatown or Chinatown as a museum or an art project. And I realized like the total hypocrisy of me saying this, because I'm like actually making a film on Chinatown. But it was one of the subjects that I had interviewed that talked about this, and it really did hit home, and it does make a lot of sense. Like, in our efforts to save Chinatown, we do need to tell its story. It's what gives it meaning, and the longer we take to tell the story, often the richer it becomes, because you uncover more and more layers. But we also have to remember that this is a living community that we're talking about. And, very real life people are facing urgent and immediate needs on the ground. So we can't overlook the needs or these needs in our efforts just to tell Chinatown's story. And I know I'm a bit over time, so I'll kind of wrap it up by saying, we're always talking about like, what are these abstract things like intangible cultural heritage or inclusive neighborhoods, but what does that really look like? And to me, I found that it looks like places like Wing on Wo down in New York City or Cam Wai Dim Sum in Vancouver. These are multi-generational businesses who are committed to Chinatown, and they're committed to larger goals beyond the bottom line of their business. And they're working in the everyday with the community. Their businesses have become community gathering spaces and spaces of safety for folks who are often marginalized or low income. So we need to make sure in our efforts, like to make these kind of long-term plans for the protections of Chinatown, that we're also devising mechanisms to support and grow these types of places, where these values and the aspirations that we hope for a vibrant and inclusive Chinatown are really playing out in real time on a daily level. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm a bit over time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Karen. And we're going to have hopefully some time to discuss and some of the things you've raised. And before I go over to our next speaker, Amy Go, it's interesting when you mentioned it's often hard, as you talked about being able to tell just from a sign whether something is Chinese, it's run in a way that's tied to the community. And I think of often outsiders. I'll give another example in Chinatown of Kissa Tanto and Alain, the owner and chef. He's been so tied to the legacy stewardship group effort, and from the outside it might be very difficult. What's the difference between, say, a Sai Wu and a Kissa Tanto? But in fact, as you said, it's often you'd have to be on the ground, actually, in some sense, to know how much he's worked with the community through COVID, helping feed seniors. And so thanks for that way of almost nuancing. It's not just the superficial in some sense that it's almost like the equivalent of greenwashing in Chinatown circles. Someone's gonna have to come up with a term of maybe Barbara when she's by then she'll have something. But I want to pass on to thanks, Karen. Pass on to the next speaker from Toronto, the Chinese Canadian National Congress Social Justice and CCNCSJ, who's been very active in terms of calling out the anti-Asian racism and the surge of violence over the last 18 months plus. And so it's an honor to have Amy Go join us from from Toronto. Amy?
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you very much for this honor to be part of this amazing panel and on this very important event. I'm going to share my presentation too. Can you all see it? Yes. Okay, great. There. Okay. So I'm in Toronto, which is also, I'm grateful to be on the traditional territories of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And now it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We definitely should be very grateful to be in this amazing native land. So in Toronto, we actually have more than one Chinatown, started in, of course, the late 1800s, early 1910s. We have the ward area, which is, of course, the downtown area where new immigrants go. And many of these communities built their home and settled there. Early Chinese pioneers, no exception, and started the development in that area, which is near actually our City Hall, the City of Toronto City Hall, along Bay Street, Dundas, and South Queen Street. I live actually very close to that area currently. And because, as Karen said, because of the development, in fact, Chinatown, early Chinatown was driven west because of the development of the Nathan Phillips Square as well as the City Hall. So now the Chinatown, the oldest Chinatown now is along Spadina and Dundas area where you see that colorful picture in the middle here, top middle here. And this is not the only Chinatown. This Chinatown has also been changed. We have seen the difference wave of immigration and changed the demographics of Chinatown. When during the late 1970s and early 80s, when people from refugee, mostly from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos came to Toronto, they also started building communities that catered to their to support their services and to support their communities. And so they built, we call the East Toronto Chinatown, which is the top left picture. It is along Broadview and Girard. And I used to work for 11 years in Wood Green Community Center. It's called Riverdale Community. And that's where the most of the refugees and immigrants from Southeast Asia would settle. And in 1984, if you look at the top bottom right corner, the first North American Chinese mall, it's called, was built in Scarborough. At the time, Hong Kong immigrants from Toronto, many of them moved to Scarborough, and then new immigrants from Hong Kong also gathered there and built this mall. And then starting also in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, we've seen more immigrants now in York region, in Markham, in Richmond Hill. And so Times Square is again a landmark now in Richmond Hill, which is a big mall that caters to the Chinese Canadian community in the York region area. And then we also see the expansion of the Chinese and the growth of Chinese Canadian community in the Peel region, which is west of Toronto in Mississauga. So you see that pagoda there, which is actually in Mississauga. So all these Chinatowns we call in GTA have met with resistance. And it's no different. The language being used, the assault, the abuse, the racism that they experience are no different. They are called, as Karen said, they are called dirty. They are called, that they are called, gamblers, the opium dens, and they are where the diseases are. And it's the same, right? When Toronto's Star actually echoed what our Prime Minister Mackenzie said about the seductive vices of Orientalism, they were talking about Chinese immigrants. They were talking about Chinatown in Toronto. And when the Dragon City Mall was opening up in Scarborough, racist literature was distributed in the neighborhood right away. And Markham's deputy mayor at the time, Carol Bell, in 1995, called these Chinese that we brought, like the Chinese stick to themselves. They don't mingle, they don't integrate, and they actually sort of ruin the backbone of the communities. And the backbone of the communities to this mayor is the long-term residents who are white. So all these comments and all these racist backlash against the development is still very much alive and well. And so when throughout the pandemic, you can see people either staying away from Chinatown and not going to the businesses. And in fact, if you go to Chinatown right now, just 2 blocks from where I live, many of the businesses are closing down. They did not survive the pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with the perception that Chinese are dirty. These Chinese businesses are bringing diseases to Canada and to our communities, to our neighborhoods. And in fact, and so there was a group of Chinese Canadian artists who started this program and a project called Long Time No See, which asked the communities, members like me, like others, to share their perspectives of Chinatown, to identify a place that is of particular significance to them and talk about that connection. And so to me, Chinatown has always held a very special place because that's where the organizing took place. CCNC, the first CCNC in 1980, held the first fundraiser in the International Restaurant in Chinatown. And the first fundraising dinner for the redress campaign was also held in International Restaurant in Chinatown. And there are many, many stories that many of us could share. So actually now, I recently asked my family members about Chinatown and asked them, why is Chinatown significant to you? My family members came with, some of us were from Hong Kong, some of them were born in Canada, some of us were born in the Philippines. So I asked them, what do you think? And those who were born in Toronto in particular said, going to Chinatown is to be Chinese, because it's part of our life. Going to dim sum every Sunday in Chinatown. It is part of my identity. It is part of the community that I belong to. And it is also part of Toronto's history. And I have to say that some of the younger generations within my family did not have that close of connection, emotional connection. However, what they said was that we need to keep Chinatown because otherwise it will be just a city, whitewashed, bland city. There is no character, no recognition of our history. And of course, when I asked my sister, who is now Madame Justice Go, about why is Chinatown important, it is important because that's where new immigrants still go, particularly those who are not fluent in English. Chinatown is important for the survival, just like Chinatown was important for the survival of the communities in the 1800s in Victoria, in Montreal, in Edmonton, in Calgary, and in Toronto. It is, for the Chinese community to survive, to thrive, to grow. Chinatown, it plays such a critical role. It offers jobs, support, services, and more importantly is that sense of belonging and a sense of community. And many of us are very sad to see parts of Chinatown in Toronto are shutting down and closing down. And so what are we really talking about when we are talking about preserving Chinatown and keeping Chinatown? Are we talking about the history? Are we talking about plaques? Are we talking about the heritage? Are we talking about businesses? Are we talking about food and architecture, livelihood, identity, and being Chinese Canadian? My answer is it's all of the above. Because these are the questions that my family member was asking me. What are you talking about when you're talking about preserving Chinese Chinatown? I said, these are everything that I think it's important to preserve. And so recently we joined hands with the Canadian Studies program at U of T through Professor Siobhan O'Flynn. We got in touch with her and we are looking at how do we ensure that Chinatown in Toronto will be preserved as a heritage conservation district in Toronto. And in Heritage Conservation District in Ontario actually is governed by the provincial law, but that actually law, the legislation, in fact, downloaded that responsibility to municipal governments. And so actually it did that because of that downloading, the designation is applied very inconsistently because it really depends on the local residents and new local municipalities to do that kind of work. And if you look at the Toronto website on the designation of conservation districts, there are currently 16 of them. And I looked at all 16 of them and I'm familiar with them. And these are all, they are preserved because that's where the white people still live. That's where they lived and that's where they still live. The Victorian houses, usually actually talks about the residential housing, the architecture, and that's where white people used to stay. And interestingly, actually, even white people, such as we have areas such as Little Portugal, Little Italy, they were not there either. These 16 districts, none of them would mention the so-called quote unquote ethnic. And the districts in Toronto that are not even mentioned and not even considered are, for example, we have a Little India in not far from the Chinatown in East Toronto on Gerrard Street. We also have a Little Jamaica. We also, of course, have Chinatown. And there are also 9 areas that are under development as a conservation district. And one of them is Kensington Market. That's where actually it is right beside Chinatown. It is where the Jewish communities first settled in Toronto. And Kensington Market remained a very, very interesting and very attractive area because of the vibrancy of the communities that kept it alive and kept it, true to its root. And so if we look at conservation of an area and try to keep Chinatown, Toronto as it is, we need to apply a social justice lens, as Karen saying. It's really not just, of course, the architecture. We need to look at, what do we mean by having an anti-racist, anti-oppressive and lens to that, which actually would addresses the intersectionality of oppression. Of course, we need to have the history told by the racialized communities and the communities that are marginalized. So if you look at Chinatown, of course, we need the history, the Chinatown history told by the not only the business owners, but the workers, but the residents, but the as well as the communities. Just like, the Long Time No See project how communities really connect with Chinatown. And particularly, we need to look at those that are marginalized, the workers, the and the tenants, who may never have been asked about why Chinatown is important to them. And of course, we need to protect the character of the physical landscape, the architecture, because protecting that is not only, of course, the historical piece, but also protecting them from development. And development, to me, if not well managed, and if it does not recognize the needs and the community's concerns and all that, development inevitably, as Karen said, would only deepen racial, social, and economic disparities. So for me, to have a heritage conservation area is not to allow that kind of development. It's not to drive the communities even more divided in terms of the rich and the poor, and drive the people who cannot afford to stay there out of that area, out of their own home. And so the heritage conservation also has to come with advancing economic, social development for racialized communities. And let's not romanticize Chinatown. Because, as a social worker who used to work close to Chinatown, as a social worker that have also been very involved in social justice movement, we know that there is exploitation. Years ago, the University Settlement House in Toronto wrote a report on Chinese restaurant workers and their plight. CCMC Toronto recently also developed a report on workers who are Chinese Canadian. Many of them are frontline workers. They work in grocery stores, they work in restaurants, and they unfortunately may not have been even enjoying the same rights as workers working elsewhere, and particularly those with precarious immigration status definitely are being exploited. As well, we also know that tenants, living in Chinatown, not necessarily are enjoying their full rights as tenants. So I think we don't need to romanticize. We need to recognize that there are issues, there are problems. So the destination is to allow development, allow economic and social development that would and has to go in tandem with that destination, so that there is affordable housing, so that there are well-paid jobs, so that workers, tenants' rights are all protected. So I'm going to end here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And we're so honored to actually have Amy go join us, and we wish we could have also had her sister. Both Amy as a social worker, long time, and her sister is now a Supreme Court Justice, Avi Go, who also helped found, the a legal clinic that precisely was fighting for the issues that Amy has raised for us. So thanks on that. And it's interesting how that much of what you brought up echo these themes that have come up in the morning and in the early afternoon. We just saw a film about the Punjabi market in Vancouver, and Karen raised the kind of very complex urban fabric of all the cities that we're talking about, and how do we honor that past and yet still be talking about the livability and the living communities that are there right now. And thanks to both of you for really hammering home those themes. I want to thanks Amy. I want to pass it on to our third speaker. Sean is joining us from Edmonton, and again, please go look at the bio online. I want to go right to share this, to have him share his thoughts from what he's seeing there. Sean?
Hello. All right. Sorry, I have like a few pages that I have to make sure that I'm sorting through correctly. So hi, my name is Sean C. Zhe Siu Long in Cantonese. he, him pronouns. I'm based in Amiskwaci, Waskahikan, Cree for Beaver Mountain House, also known as Edmonton. When I say Amiskwaci, Waskahikan, I'm acknowledging that I'm on Indigenous land, Treaty 6 territory, and the Métis homeland. This is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. The names of our land, neighborhoods, stories are important, and we must acknowledge that we are on stolen Indigenous land. And so, sorry, I missed this slide. I really wish that people could see the pronunciation, because whenever you come here, then you could pronounce Amiskwaci Waskahikan with me. So terra nullius is a concept. It's taken from Latin for nobody's land, the idea that the land is empty or unused. And this is a very colonial philosophy that was used to justify stealing Indigenous land and encouraging settlers to move in by buying land parcels for agricultural development. This is the same philosophy that is used today when we look at gentrification of racialized and poor communities. So we must acknowledge these colonial histories and find ways to co-create new communities if we want to see a thriving Chinatown. When I say Amiskwaci Waskahikan, I also think about how misinformed I was growing up, singing the Canadian anthem to be strong and free, while to this day, Indigenous survivors have no justice from a country that tried to erase them. The Canada I know now and have perpetuated is seriously fractured nationally, provincially, and locally, and I believe we must put our energy towards building up healthy relationships in our grassroots communities if we want to see improvements across the country. My biggest concern for Chinatown is there are so many complex challenges to address. So how is it possible to build relationships when every group is operating in such a state of crisis? We have a growing housing and drug crisis, which requires all three levels of government to be on the same page, and they're not. Indigenous people are largely represented in this group, and there continues to be systemic and intercultural racism. 30% of small businesses have left Chinatown since the pandemic, and a rise in property damage and crime. Meanwhile, our historic Chinatown community and elder care spaces, and so this is Chinatown South, these spaces exist in a desert of parking lots, and our city is hoping that with our new light rail line, it will attract more investment and revenue for that part of downtown, which continues to see our cultural and historical strengths disappear. Like in 2017, our iconic Chinatown Gate was removed to build the light rail line. All of these issues are a product of fractured organization and consultation from people that need to be co-creating solutions with our system's decision makers. So how do we prove that our cultural spaces bring value to the community? How can we build up our community voice urgently to advocate how our public spaces and taxes are used? We need to come together holistically, internally, and interculturally with a diverse understanding of each other's needs, because dividing up these resources isn't going to work if we want to have a healthy shared neighborhood. So you're probably wondering, what do you, Sean, actually do in Chinatown? My background is in film and education, and so I've been documenting a lot of the changes through a variety of storytelling projects. I'm part of Aya Artist Collective. which came together to create more spaces for community to say goodbye when the Harbin Gate was removed. Recently, I also co-organized a Chinatown Arts Initiative, or Chinatown Arts Fundraising Initiative, called Chinatown Greetings with my friend Emily Chu. And I guess my biggest skin in the game that you could say is that in 2019, with no experience in property ownership, but seeing how rapidly our Chinatown South area was changing, my partner and I put our savings into purchasing a vacant lot with future dreams of building a Chinatown community art space. And just to break and add some humor, my joke inputted here was that now we're separated, but we're not separated. And I realized that that's not a good joke, so I'm not going to say it, but I already said it. So I said it. And it's supposed to break some tension. I see Karen laughing, so it's good. All right. This land ownership has taught me a lot about, and helped me also articulate better why connecting and working with neighbors in the area is so important. And so my lot is like right next to the Chinese United Church there. It's just, a vacant space. Since the lot was vacant, I wanted to make sure that it could be used in the same way for community by community. And I was really inspired by 221A's Vancouver's Project Semi-Public. And I began starting to connect with my neighbors around like the Salvation Army's Men's Shelter, Ochichiwan, an Indigenous Contemporary Arts Center, and the Chinese United Church to see if there was any interest in collaborating on a community garden. So Ochichiwan, serendipitously, were planning an Indigenous community garden, and we were able to provide them with a space to create Kamamak Nita Wike Chikan, which means butterfly garden in Cree. This summer, there has also been new community relationships built between the Chinese United Church, and so that's their wall, and Ochichiwan to collaborate on this mural by Canto Dene Irish artist Evan Matchett Manus Wong that shows intercultural appreciation through plants and drumming. My favorite highlight of the year was an outdoor screen printing event co-hosted by Ochichiwan and Snap Gallery, which brought together Prairie Sage Protectors, a really important grassroots group that's really helping the houseless folks who live and are around Chinatown, and Aya to design land patches. And Aya was really honored to work with artist Paul Jiang, who incorporated images of Saskatoon berries native to Alberta, our provincial flower, the wild rose, and Chinatown's favorite goji berry as a symbol of our diverse identities. We had lots of fun printing these patches, but this event also gave many local artists and organizers space to have dialogue about intercultural solidarity and our shared responsibility to Indigenous reconciliation. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak about our Chinatown in Amisquachi, Waskaikan. And I look forward to building on these connections with anyone here today watching. If you're in town, it would be a pleasure to show you around. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. And thank you also for talking about a lot of the grassroots work that you've and others done in Edmonton. Again, there's a lot of parallels over the last, I'd say, 10 plus years over in Vancouver as well. And I'm sure some of the people in the audience here are hearing a lot of your remarks resonating with their own work and lives. So thank you, Malcolm. It's a pleasure to now kind of go conceptually across the border to the other major Chinatown in North America that people often connect to Vancouver. It's people talk about Vancouver, the largest Chinatown after San Francisco, or they'll say along with San Francisco, the two. And so it's important that we have someone from San Francisco Chinatown to actually share, in a lot of ways, some of the similar challenges, but also very different. And so welcome Malcolm Young to join us and to share his perspective from the Chinatown Development Corporation of San Francisco, Chinatown.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Vincent, and everybody else for giving me the opportunity to participate. And I want to just start off by acknowledging I think I might be the only American in the room, so I feel a little insecure, and I need to give some of my international street cred. I did, as a high school student, spend many of my summers in Ottawa. Growing up, working at a small pharmacy there that my uncle owned, and also a number of summers in Hong Kong. And I also lived in Yokohama for a year as a youngster, and actually right next door to the Chinatown over there. And that was an incredible experience. So I'm saying all this to paint a picture of me as being somebody who hopefully thinks a little bit beyond kind of what America is sort of perceived as. Let me just share my screen really quickly here. So I'm the executive director at an organization called Chinatown Community Development Center. I'm really just part of a 44-year legacy of this organization, whose mission is really centered around this idea of building community, and building community specifically in places where immigrants are at. And as our name connotes, for us, that's Chinatown, San Francisco. Before I start, I realize I want to just put some context around Chinatown, San Francisco, so people can kind of understand. A lot of the issues that folks have raised here today are issues that Chinatown, San Francisco has faced and continues to face, particularly these issues around development being a driver for extinguishing our communities. Chinatown, San Francisco is actually was founded in 1850. It's the first Chinatown in the United States, possibly in North America, but I don't want to claim that because I'm not exactly sure if that's true. For us, we planted our flag actually literally at the mouth of the port in San Francisco. And so from the very beginning, Chinatown, San Francisco has been sitting on literally the most valuable real estate in all the city. Currently, we are sandwiched between the financial district of San Francisco and a neighborhood called Nob Hill. And I think many of you know, when you have Hill in your neighborhood name, the rents are really high. So that kind of situates us in terms of where we're at. Throughout the history of this community, the San Francisco founding fathers, and I say fathers very intentionally, have tried to eliminate this community on numerous occasions. The first time and the most well-known time was actually in 1906, after the Great San Francisco earthquake, in which most of the city burned down. Chinatown also burned down. And in that moment, the city founding fathers rushed to try to transplant Chinatown, remove us from where we're at now, to the southeast part of the city where the mudflats are located. So they tried to move us from bedrock to mudflats, and the community rallied at that time, led primarily by the family associations, to rebuild Chinatown and rebuild it faster than literally any other community in the city, using an architectural style that firmly kind of cemented our identity as Chinese, and they were intentional about it. They weren't actually mimicking the architecture going on in Chinatown. They actually orientalized it even more to make the message extremely clear in terms of where you're at. Throughout the next several decades, other attempts were made. And fast forward to the 60s and 70s, a period in which the financial district in San Francisco was actually starting to grow. If anyone's been to San Francisco, our financial district is in this area that's essentially north of what's called Market Street. It borders Chinatown. But what folks don't know is that the entire financial district actually used to be a Filipino community, Little Manila. It used to be occupied by single room occupancy hotels, and served basically a function for the Filipino community that Chinatown played for the Chinese community. But as the financial district was growing, and as the city again, fathers were rezoning the city and redeveloping the city for more development. Those SROs in Manila town were literally bought up piece by piece, demolished, and converted into high-rise downtown offices. And this became a real catalyst for the Chinatown community. It was happening in a time when the civil rights movement was really starting to grow and launch. And the civil rights movement really, I think, catalyzed a lot of student organizing in San Francisco. And ultimately, those students came back into Chinatown to organize around this concept of trying to protect Chinatown and protect Chinatown against being eliminated and erased in the same way that Manila town was done. For our community, Chinatown was incredibly important to preserve, and I think all of you have articulated a number of reasons why, but I want to be, kind of specific about sort of for us, what the context of preservation and trying to make sure Chinatown stayed Chinatown was. For I think Chinatown, Community Development Center and a number of the younger student activists, family associations, a lot of folks in the community, the core function of Chinatown was really this idea of an immigrant gateway. This notion that it's a place where new immigrant households can land, find residential housing, which is sort of the village component of this diagram, seek resources to essentially launch their lives and their livelihood, and ultimately use that Chinatown as a launching pad into sort of the broader American economy. And the tourist center part of it is just more modern, but it's acknowledging that Chinatown is an economy, and the economy does need to be driven by an engine. And in addition to sort of the residential drivers of the economy, tourism is also a driver. And in many ways, I actually welcome tourism as an economic development strategy because what I love about tourists is they come, they spend money, and then they leave. They don't try to stay and buy that kitschy loft or SRO and eventually try to gentrify it. And so we still hold on to tourism as an economic development strategy. So coming out of the 60s and 70s, as downtown expansion was happening and Chinatown was literally under threat of extinction, Chinatown Community Development Center, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce here in San Francisco, a number of family associations and other nonprofit organizations came together to organize against kind of this effort to really redevelop and extinguish Chinatown. And the primary tool that we centered our efforts around, in addition to the organizing work, was planning, community planning in particular. And through a 7-year struggle from 1979 to 1986, the community came up with a plan for Chinatown, which essentially protected the integrity of the community. And in 1987, mustered the political muscle and organizing muscle to actually get the plan passed. I actually am starting with this image because this image is literally the framework for that plan. And as you can see, it probably was created in the 70s because the graphics are pretty from that era. But this is really sort of what captures the intent of the plan. This idea of Chinatown as a village, a residential village in particular, and I would layer on top of that an affordable residential village, the idea of Chinatown as a cultural capital or capital city for Chinese Americans in the Bay Area, and then of course a tourist and visitor center. So the plan and the zoning for the plan is organized around this concept. If I was to update sort of this intent to 2021, the fourth layer I would add on is this idea of Chinatown as a service and health hub for the Chinese American community. Chinatown is now actually a community that has one of the highest concentrations of nonprofit service organizations. We have something between 40 and 50 located in Chinatown. We also are a health hub in the sense that we have 2 major health networks in Chinatown that are community serving, and we have a Chinese hospital, which is actually where Bruce Lee was born. It's been rebuilt a couple times over, but again, the integrity of the institution continues to really be there and serves Chinatown. So Chinatown has actually added a function since the 60s and 70s and 80s, ultimately when this plan was created, which again heightens the reason for why we think Chinatown needs to be not only just saved, but enhanced and made more vital. Some demographics of 2021 Chinatown. I think there's some mistakes here, but that's okay. As I'm looking at it now, I should have reviewed this a little bit more closer. But Chinatown geographically is between 1/8 and 1/4 of a square mile here in San Francisco. But the population of Chinatown is about 14,400 to 18,000 individuals, depending on kind of how you count the borders. This makes Chinatown San Francisco the densest residential neighborhood in the country outside of Chinatown and Manhattan. And roughly 80 to 90% of those occupants are low income to extremely low income. So Chinatown very much still serves low income new immigrant households and now more and more seniors who are aging in place. But I wanted to point to this because I really wanted to make sure people understood that San Francisco Chinatown isn't just a tourist trap, but it's a living, breathing community. Chinatown within this sort of 1/4 square mile has 1,200 active ground floor storefronts. That makes it one of the densest commercial districts anywhere in the country. And if you average out about 3 jobs per small business, it's about 3,600 jobs, many of which are filled by low-income monolingual immigrants. And so Chinatown is a starter job hub for so many of these new households that come in. But I want to be mindful because I think it was Karen who made this remark. Let's also not romanticize this function because while it creates many starter jobs, many of those jobs don't provide living wage, and we need to be mindful of that as part of the broader struggle. So I'm pointing to this, kind of slide because I wanted to just highlight and reemphasize, this idea and this function of Chinatown as an immigrant gateway and how it still serves that role today. We'll post in the link a link to a short film that we just produced to sort of highlight this story. It's called Chinatown in the Heart. I don't want to play it now in the interest of time, but if you have a chance, we'd love it if you could check it out because ultimately, that's what Chinatown is, I think, in many ways. It's a place where people got their start, and we wanted to kind of highlight the generations of folks from folks who are in their 80s to folks who are young activists in their 20s who have really viewed Chinatown as that. And so, there's almost a secret sort of version of Chinatown that I try not to talk about very much because, when I'm not amongst you folks, people get rubbed the wrong way. But the other kind of thing about Chinatown is that it's a political center. It's a political center of gravity, and it's a place where we can truly build grassroots power if we can kind of maintain the integrity of the immigrant gateway function. And I think sometimes that gets overlooked in terms of how places and power and politics and organizing actually tie together and are inseparable. So for Chinatown CDC, our mission has been to build community, but it's really been more so to kind of build that community and protect the integrity of Chinatown as we imagined and scoped it out in the Chinatown plan. And we use several tools to try to protect the integrity of Chinatown. The plan itself, of course, is a huge tool, but the foundation for the work that we do is built around organizing and grassroots organizing at that. You'll hear another version of this organization in a couple minutes. We're probably better known for that, but at the heart and soul of what we do is grassroots power. Everything we do is oriented towards grassroots power, and we're currently in a position where we provide support for 3 self-governed grassroots entities that constitute a very significant political power block in San Francisco, especially given how many Chinese there are in this city. We support an organization called the Community Tenants Association. That's near and dear to my heart. I got my start as an eviction defense attorney at a legal services agency called Asian Law Caucus. But CTA is the largest paid membership tenant organization in the city of San Francisco. It's 2,000 strong. It's its own nonprofit organization with a self-governed board that is led by some pretty dynamic leaders, one of which I'll introduce in a second. We also work with the public housing or the former public housing resident association called Pingyun Resident Improvement Association, or PIREA. Again, PIREA is sort of another hub of power building. And about half the buildings in Chinatown, San Francisco consist of single room occupancy hotels, of which there are about 500 families living in them. And so we work with those families, all 500, to also organize for improved living conditions and exits from these SROs, because you really shouldn't be raising children in these buildings. At the same time, they're necessary because they're some of the last affordable housing in a place like San Francisco. There we go. Another tool that we really believe deeply in is leadership development. These are all graduates of our youth program. Our youth program is now 30 years old. I'm proud to say, and not ashamed to say, that about half of these individuals work at CCDC now after they graduated. Another half have gone into government. They sit on community boards. They've come out back as activists, organizers, artists, and sometimes engineers and doctors. You need them too in the movement. But we really believe that this is the pipeline for the future. And so we've invested really deeply in this idea of a leadership development program. We're super proud of this. And we try to model it after our organizing work, this idea that we're supporting self-governed, self-led entities. And so our youth actually organize themselves into two different sort of cadres, one called the Dock and Alleyway Youth Program, which is, again, has its own board. And that's more for the ABCs or the English speakers. And then we have another group called Youth for SROs, which are more the immigrant population, or the immigrant young people, to give them a space to also step into leadership. True grassroots leadership is also critical. There's a wonderful film on this woman, Cheng-Jak Lee. She's the current and historic leader of the Pingyun Resident Improvement Association that I mentioned before. And she's actually the woman, and her husband was the couple that organized the first public housing rent strike in the city of San Francisco back in the 70s. And their lawyer happened to be our former mayor, Ed Lee, who also came from activist roots. And I always said that Mrs. Lee here was the only person who could yell at the mayor and get away with it. And she did. Even into her 70s, she's still alive now. And before Ed passed, every time he came to Chinatown, she would always get on him for what he wasn't doing. And it was frankly inspiring to see that. This was a former president of Community Tenants Association. This is another incredibly dynamic woman, another woman that came from a housing movement and a tenants' rights movement, and really used that as a platform to launch herself into leadership. And we're just super proud to have been able to support kind of her work. But again, this is the foundation, I think, of everything we've been able to do. We also invest very heavily in community planning, no surprise, given sort of our origins. In the 80s and 70s and 80s, we were trying to create the plan. In the 2000s and 2020s, our goal is to protect the integrity of the plan. And so a lot of people don't love us in Chinatown for this, but we always enforce the integrity of the plan. So when we see projects, when we see uses that violate the plan, we always try to call that out and bring it to public hearing and do what we can to modify the use or stop the use to fit into sort of the intent of the plan. But it's not always easy. We're also an affordable housing developer, and this is sort of another key component to the strategy that we employ. The other pieces that I talked about was really building kind of the people and the place infrastructure. This is the brick and mortar strategy that we employ. Currently, Chinatown CDC is about a mid-sized developer in San Francisco. We own and operate 3,600 affordable housing units. They're all affordable, with about 1,000 here in Chinatown. And that's one of the things that we've really been able to build up over time, because we believe, as many of you mentioned, that communities need to be accessible. And in a San Francisco that's rapidly gentrifying, we truly believe affordability and affordable housing is the only way to kind of keep our neighborhoods equitable. We construct new housing, but we also acquire and rehab existing housing, primarily to keep people in place and to keep those units affordable for all time, so that Chinatown cannot be completely gentrified, even though folks are continuing to try. We organize around affordable housing in terms of creating resources to create more. That's a lot of work of what CTA does. They really come around that. In addition to tenant protections, they're a strong force for pushing affordable housing policy forward, and it's something that we're also proud of. We've been more effective at it in some years, less effective in others. But affordable housing advocacy is a strategy in addition to sort of the development and operation of it. More recently, though, I would say that the pandemic has really kind of exposed, I think, some other critical issues in terms of our Chinatown and its survival. A lot of folks talk about sort of the demise of Chinatowns. I think that's certainly true of San Francisco. The pandemic raised some serious concerns. But I want to just highlight something, and I want to highlight it by sort of telling the tale of two Chinatowns, because I think it's important to acknowledge that there's different economies. On the right-hand side, you'll see kind of a picture of a market on what's called Stockton Street here. And we're showing this because even during the pandemic, Stockton Street remained actually pretty busy, other than the first few months. But it remained busy primarily because it was set up and zoned as the resident-serving, community-serving component of the neighborhood, meaning this is where residents go to shop, buy their groceries, get their hair done. Well, maybe not during the pandemic, but get their barbecue duck. And it was amazing that Stockton remained vital during the pandemic, but it shouldn't be amazing because it stayed vital because of the residential density, the residential commitment to kind of Chinatown. And it was the residents that kept Stockton alive. And actually it was Stockton that kept the residents alive, literally, not just figuratively. The contrast, though, is with the picture on the left-hand side, which is a vacancy on Grant Avenue, which was designed as sort of the tourist corridor of Chinatown. It's the tourist corridor that really suffered and is seeing extreme vacancies and is under threat. On the one hand, you could say, well, who cares about the tourist corridors? But the tourist corridors are also really important, and the commercial businesses there are also really important. Because at the end of the day, they're actually a revenue source for these mixed-use buildings that are by and large low-income housing, and the commercial spaces actually subsidize some of the housing, and so the vitality of these commercial spaces are important. But it's really tricky because in a moment where we want to catalyze sort of filling some of the commercial vacancies, we don't want to do it in a way that transforms the nature of this corridor into some of the things that, people were talking about earlier. And, Henry, your comment, and I think it was Karen's comment about really understanding the nature of commercial businesses and not being able to kind of get the differentiator unless you're on the ground. That's really, really critical, because we're seeing people wanting to fill these vacancies, but fill them, with uses that may seem kind of Chinatown, but that don't actually serve the Chinatown community, don't employ the Chinatown community, don't source from the Chinatown community. And it's something that we really try to watch out for as sort of this corridor becomes quote unquote revitalized. So, that I think in many ways, defines sort of the challenge of the future for what we see with this Chinatown. While the plan has done an amazing job of protecting the integrity of this community for the last 30 years, even before the pandemic, we really started to see how the utility of the plan was breaking down as the real estate pressures of San Francisco got worse and worse. For the first time, we started seeing single room occupancy hotels converted into sort of these high-end group housing platforms, which we'd never seen before, and that zoning can't really stop. And so we're trying to look at strategies around that. And then, of course, also with the commercial vacancies, and really, I think what's coming into play is the survival of banquet spaces and other areas that spaces that help create and allow for the fabric of the community to be created. Those are also failing, and we need to figure out how to address that as well. And I think that's really the thing that we're going to be thinking about looking into the future. So I know I've taken a lot of time. I'll stop here, but I did want to just, if anyone finds themselves in San Francisco and you want to come by, take a tour, please look me up. Please look us up. We love taking people around. I really believe you can't know a community until you've walked through it, and we'd love to do that. So thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks for bringing so much of material. I think is resonant with things that the other panelists have talked about and earlier panels brought up. Before we move on, I just want to kind of recognized that someone pointed out to me that I think I called Sean Malcolm twice. So there's, the good thing about recording it is these panels is that that's going to be there forever. So, but I thought I'd point that. And I also, all this talk about development, I have development on my brain because I think I called it Chinatown Development Corporation rather than Chinatown Development Center. So a little telling again of sort of the discussion in the air. But thank you, Malcolm, for sharing a lot of information about, again, decades of work that have had. And as an aside, the I Hotel, for a long time, that's been one of those cases like 105 Kiefer. 105 Kiefer lot is still empty, and for decades the I Hotel, where a lot of those manong, those Filipino workers lived out their days in SROs, and yet it was wiped out and it was an empty parking lot for a long time. So thanks for raising some of these issues about affordability and housing that I think are very resonant with Vancouver Chinatown and the downtown east side area as well. I'm going to ask now our last speaker, Barbara Lee, who is here representing VAF, an organization, Vancouver Asian Film Festival, that she helped found, and also who did a number of films for us, this forum. So it was VAF who did, you can find it on Chinatown Reimagined, some of the films that were done by filmmakers chosen by VAF. So again, just want to make sure that people know that that's opinions and perspectives that are shown in a lot of the films are not necessarily the opinions and perspectives of the City of Vancouver's Chinatown Transformation Team or the organizers of the Chinatown Reimagined. We brought people together in this forum to share perspectives as much as possible. And so we want to thank Barbara Lee for actually bringing some of that filmmaking and ability to represent Chinatown, which is so important, as we've seen again and again. And one of the reasons why we had Karen on this panel and Sean is the arts and cultural community, you could say, is so crucial for story gathering, storytelling, story sharing. So Barbara, welcome Barbara Lee to share her perspectives.
Thanks, Henry. I do want to recognize that Andy Chu did all the videos and that VAF was just sort of a facilitator, and we gave some input on the projects. I'm going to share my screen. First, I would like to acknowledge that we at VAF are grateful to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We hope that wherever you are situated, that you also take a moment to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and communities that have cared for these lands since time immemorial. Next slide. So thank you, Baldwin and Vincent, for inviting VAF and Eliminate Hate to this panel with these impressive speakers and moderators. As most of you know, I am with the Vancouver Asian Film Festival. So today's talk is really, it's not so technical, but really, I consider myself as a bit of a storyteller. So today I'd like to share my story of my Chinatown with people here. So next. My parents immigrated to Canada as farm laborers, and they were indebted to family relatives for sponsoring them to this new country. We arrived by cargo plane, and my family settled on a farm in Richmond in the 1970s. And of course, we wanted to become Canadianized. So we learned to play ice hockey in the frozen fields, sharing one pair of skates. We originally grew Western produce, potatoes, turnips, cabbage, cauliflower, those types of vegetables. But because of the market boards and the quotas, it made it difficult to make a living. And my parents shifted the crops that they grew to Asian vegetables, such as gailan, siu choy, bok choy, hot peppers, eggplants. And most of these crops we sold to Chinatown, the stores, the restaurants, and wholesalers on Produce Row or Malcolm Drive, which is adjacent to Chinatown. And where most of the Chinatown shops, that's where they got their produce to sell. So I spent much of my childhood going to Chinatown a few times a week to help my father deliver the produce to all the store owners and shopping for my family meals. I don't recall ever shopping at a Safeway with my parents for groceries, but I have memories of my parents bartering with all the shop owners and clerks for the best cuts of meat or fish or bags of extra produce that they would give to them. My siblings and I love to go to Chinatown. with my father and to deliver the vegetables that we grew. It was a treat to go there, to feel part of a community, to see others that looked like us, and to have foods that were not readily available anywhere else but in Chinatown. In the winter, we would attend the Lower Mainland Chinese Farmers Association events. There was a Chinese Farmers Association, and we attended the Lee Association dinners, and of course, Chinese New Year's events. It was exciting, fun, and something that we always looked forward to. Next slide. So my parents loved Chinatown so much that they saved enough money to finally buy their first home just before retiring. They wanted to retire next to Chinatown. So after 20 plus years since immigrating to this country, they saw Chinatown as their future. I enjoyed spending so much time there that I bought my first house in Strathcona, which is next to Chinatown. It is the residence of Chinatown. And I became active in the community. And when I bought my little house, people were taken aback. They couldn't believe why a single woman would want to live next to Chinatown in Strathcona. But I believed that my future and my family's future was in Chinatown and in Strathcona. So next slide. So having, sorry, it's slide before that. Slide before that. So having lived so long in Chinatown and Strathcona, I do want to say that it gives you an immediate, oh, sorry, it has to go one before that. There's something, apologies, there's something wrong with my slides deck. So I just wanted to go with the family. I just wanted to say that my kids went to the Chinese Cultural Center. They went every week to learn Mandarin. We went for dim sum. We went for wonton. Chinatown was not something exotic. It was our daily life. And my father was part of the parade every year. And my children, part of their elementary school, they participated in the Chinatown's annual Chinese New Year parade for 9 years. And I think up until COVID hit, that was the last time, but they also graduated from their elementary school. So I would say that they have wonderful memories of Chinatown, not as something exotic or from the past, but it was part of their everyday life, their every weekend. And I think that they will have and develop their own relationship to Chinatown, which I think is what we hope for, is not seeing Chinatown as a ghetto, but really a refuge, a place of belonging. And I think that's what I really wanted to share. And everything that I do is grounded in my, the way I feel about Chinatown and my closeness to it from early on in my life. So next. So as you know, the Vancouver Asian Film Festival this year is our 25th year. And in 2000, we moved its home to Cinemark in 2000, which is in International Village, and which is on the edge of Chinatown. It sort of is where Yaletown, Chinatown, downtown, Gastown all sort of converge. And what we try to do is for the 4 days is that we bring people down to Chinatown and we try to use some of the services, use some of the restaurants. We host things at Floater Restaurant, Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens, Sai Wu, even though after this talk, I've heard that it hasn't been a great community partner. And also other places like Wild Rice that no longer exist. So Chinatown to Vath and to us is something that we see our future. This year, our theme is past, present, and possibilities. We see it as something that we can build upon and that it can be reinvented, reimagined. It's not something that is static and a memory. It's about what we can do and with the place, how we evolve, how VAF evolves as an organization, how it can be so much more. So I'd like to get to the next slide. So some of the things that we've done, we know that Chinatown, what happened was when the COVID hit, there was a lot of anti-Asian racism that happened, and we knew that Chinatown was targeted. So we decided that we wanted to lend our platform to try to address some of this anti-Asian racism. And what we did was we worked with Project 1907 to launch a community reporting page, and that data was posted, and also we combined it with AMIGO and the NCSJ to get a national view. I think what I wanted to show here is that what VAF believes is in collaboration and partnership, and that Chinatown, if we are to do this, we all have to come together. We have to find ways to connect with each other, find ways to look at all the issues that everybody has raised, and find a common ground that we can all work in our lane, that we don't have to be fighting against each other. One of the things that we always talk about is that marginalized, racialized groups are pitted against each other, either for funding or just whose mission or statement is more important than the other. And I think we all are important. Everything is important, and we all have to find how we can work together, because keeping us fractured is not going to get us ahead. It's not going to get us to where we need to be. And so a lot of these projects I brought up just because we couldn't have achieved any of this without all of us working together. The style guide was a way to address how media was portraying Asian communities in their storytelling. So we asked many journalists, many community groups to tell us what they thought, and then we pulled all that information. We had a healing and sharing circle so that we can create safe spaces so that people can talk about what was happening to them. The CHA project was a community board that people could talk about their thoughts and feelings around anti-Asian racism. We have videos, and we also supported other groups that were organizing rallies and protests. So we're really here to help other groups. We are a film festival. We use the power of media, arts to get messages across. So that's what we're here to do. If there is an organization that needs a platform, needs their messages amplified, we're here to help. We're here to help Chinatown. Chinatown is very close to my heart, just because it's been a big part of my life, my family life, my work life. I worked in Chinatown. I had a home office. Our festivals there. It's really about I see it as the future, as long as we honor the past. So I wanted to go to, here we go. So we see Chinatown as a place for community gatherings. It is an artist hub and a foodie destination. And as I said, we really need to find a way to have a shared vision and to move forward. I really like what Malcolm said, that they had a community plan. I think that would be great if we can develop that, some ideas, even though some people may not like the idea of tourists coming. I think that that's really important to have that wave of people coming in on a regular basis, maybe even a daily basis. If that means some sort of an anchor tenant that is an ally to the community and understands the nuances of the community. I think it would be great to have a 1907 anti-Asian riot trail, similar to Boston's Freedom Trail, even though it's a dark part of this city's history. I think it's important to educate the community about it and other people to come down and learn about it. Things like a Chinatown passport, so that people can go to different spots to learn more about the community and not just be a one place destination that they have to come and they want to search and sort of meander through and learn about the community and get a deeper appreciation for it. I think I really wanted to end with that Chinatown doesn't belong to one group or one idea. It's a home to all ideas and all people, and it's our shared future that we should be forging. And this doesn't mean that we need to forget the past, but we can look for a future and honor the past as well. So I just wanted to give those sort of ideas. We really are here to say that VAF is a collaborator, and I can't speak today, and that we're looking to help other groups if they're wanting it. We will try to offer our platforms to amplify your messages. And this last slide is just to let you know that we have our 25th anniversary coming up. It's a celebration of all the stories of the community. Then there's some great stories to be shared, some about Chinatown, some of the people that live and work here for many, many years. There's stories of diaspora around the world with similar struggles. And I hope to see you. I hope to see you at the festival, and thank you. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. It's thrown me off a little bit. And Henry, I didn't think of a word in the time that I had listening to everybody. I didn't think of a word to try to explain everything, but
thanks.
I really wanted to end with the idea that Chinatown is not the past. It is the past, it's the present and the future. And if we can keep that in mind, I think we can do great things all together.
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara. And I'm, again, to everyone who's joined us, and I know some of you've actually been listening into the panels all day. If I'm gonna ask actually each of the panelists. I'm just going to go around kind of rapid fire style in the order that they spoke, and just to kind of ask you, what do you want to see? And especially I think we've heard a lot of I think things from each of you about the places you are in. And I know that for me, there's some things that we could bring to Vancouver that is happening somewhere else, and I'm sure there's a little bit of that. One of the rationales for this panel, in fact, was in connecting Chinatowns up, and we've heard a lot about organizing and the importance of working together. And this is across all these other Chinatowns, but I also have heard how for each of you that the Chinatowns and that you're in are not in isolation either. That what's going on in Montreal in terms of the communities, the Jewish, the historical Jewish community that's next door, and working together across intra-community, intracultural connections. Again, Sean, I really appreciated the kind of depth of what does it mean to acknowledge, but also to work in Indigenous territory, to acknowledge that that's not just a land acknowledgement per se, but also that it means a politics of not thinking that there's a prior claim just because Chinatowns have existed for a long time. So I just want to throw it out as your kind of takeaway from the conversation today, and what you think is a kind of a priority that we should be doing, as we've listened to each other. Karen, just throw that to you first.
Well, I think like one of the kind of aspirations we have, it's like this idea of how do you bring your community along with you when you want to have these kind of more inclusive discussions or really kind of bring things forward. Like Montreal Chinatown is smaller, and we need to work with our community. We are not big enough to have like major internal divisions. We kind of have to bring everyone with us, and like I was out in Vancouver, and the conversations around decolonization are much more advanced, and I would say at least a decade or more than where we are in Quebec. But our Chinatown, there's such opportunity here. We have 2 native shelters that basically bookend our Chinatown. But the racism that's gone on during COVID, the houseless issues, drug issues, like all these kind of issues that several of our Chinatowns have, it creates tension in the community, and it creates tension with issues of security, policing, all these kind of things. But there's such opportunity in Montreal to work directly with the Native community that's present in our Chinatown, and to find these kind of alternatives to like the regular kind of policing system. So, but to do that, we need to bring our community with us into this kind of more advanced discussion on creating a community that's more inclusive, and remembering that we were in Chinatown because of racism. So when we build the future for Chinatown, we don't want to marginalize and exclude other folks who are also marginalized in their own life. So I guess that's my hope for Montreal and all Chinatowns.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks a lot. Amy.
Just want to echo what Karen said. I think each area, each city, and then each community will have to build those bridges and build those solidarity movement and identify the partners, bringing along, of course, the Chinatown community, as well as the big broader community. Again, applying that social justice lens, applying that decolonization lens, applying all that anti-oppression lens to this work. And I think it is important to recognize that this is not an easy, this is, it's like, fighting racism, right? I mean, it's not an easy road, and there's like a long way to go. So while each community is working locally, I would love to see this kind of continuing dialogue, as we are working collaboratively with UBC and others across the country, as Barbara said, that we need to build that kind of resources, and shared experiences and shared understanding, as well as the advocacy that we can, of course, bring together. I think much stronger if we have that kind of collaboration across the city and North America. With Malcolm, I've learned so much from Malcolm's presentation about San Francisco, and I would love to see that kind of thoughtful, deliberate, and truly community-based planning to Toronto and to other cities too. So.
Thanks, and it does that. There's been this 2-year plus process here with the Legacy Stewardship Group with 36 members of community, and it's interesting how that kind of community, based planning. It is, I think, something that maybe has a longer history in San Francisco, but it could really use a boost here in Canada. And several people have mentioned the need for 3 levels of government, and in some sense, the only way to get that highest level of government involved is to actually connect up Chinatowns across the country. And so really, both your remarks really resonate, I think, with that need to actually organize not just locally, but also across the various cities. Sean.
I think Karen and Amy went through pretty much a lot of the same points that I wanted to kind of discuss. I mean, Edmonton has a similar capacity. Like, we don't have the density as some of the other big cities, and so my worry with new things is that it's more work, right? And so how do we think about this strategically, where it actually, people can continue doing the work that they do, but the work that they do and the community building that we're talking about is ingrained in the process of what they're already doing, right? So that, as an efficiency, I think, however that is possible. I mean, I look at CTT as like one of those, I would say, very progressive supports to have Vancouver, basically have a wing of planners, helping Chinatown out. We don't have something like that, right? That would be amazing. That would like cut a lot of the organizational capacity down. And so, if we could, I guess, see through CTC's experience and talk about what the positives are in that, perhaps that could be also something shared from a municipal standpoint on models that of how the city could really be one of those things that's not just performative when we talk about anti-racism or capacity building, but actually part of the solution. So that, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, and that's I think someone's got to be taking that note down, that CTT in fact should be saying what has worked, and same with the community members who've been involved in the LSG, sort of saying what has worked that in fact perhaps provides a kind of a path forward for, and I hear about infrastructure and capacity. Those are so important, because otherwise you're expecting NPOs, nonprofits, to carry a huge load, often volunteer time. And I heard that again when Jessica this morning and Karen echoed it. For 2 years since 2019, it's been volunteers who've been trying to save Montreal Chinatown, at perhaps a point of existential threat that's different than perhaps now is in some of the other places that we're talking about, or Toronto's multiple locations is partly because some of the earlier locations of Chinatown were not quote saved, they were erased, so that the Chinese community had to start over somewhere else. Malcolm, you've shared so much from China, the San Francisco situation, and I think we've all learned a lot. Any kind of thoughts or remarks just from your participation in today's discussion?
I think for me, my kind of just closing thought echoes a lot of what's here, but sometimes this work can be really lonely. And when I say this work, I mean not only kind of the social justice work, but actually the work around elevating places as a locus of power and of a place where people and power can come together. I think that at least in the US, a lot of the movement work in the API community centers around civil rights, other sort of issue-based areas, but not really around places. And to me, I just want to thank everybody for including us in this, because it's a reminder that there are people out there who care about places, who care about our places. And I just think it's so important for us to continue connecting, because I think we need to be building movement around places.
I'm glad you raised that placemaking, that kind of site of meaning making, because you talked about these young people, getting involved generation after generation with CDC in San Francisco, and we saw that with 105 Kiefer fight, lots of young people coming in, and for those who don't know the story, on Chinatown Reimagined, we'll put up a link or send out to you about a film, Clash on Kiefer, that was just there's a special preview for those registered for this conference to watch a film made by Chester Sid of Dynastic Entertainment, just about the story of how young people get fired up and involved, and a generation before in Vancouver was the freeway fight that got another generation that maybe they're now in their 70s and 80s, but they were young once, and what got them involved in the fight, you could say, was to save Chinatown from the freeway, as we heard this morning. So thanks for putting that placemaking and meaningful, the power and politics of place and how important it is for everything we're talking about today. Barbara.
I just wanted to say that that sustaining change and not being burnt out. I mean, as I said in my story, I've been here 20 years. There's other fights that I was out there protesting the garbage recycle plant that they went to put by Chinatown. Nobody knows about that, but it was lonely being my father and just a few other people, fighting the triage being moved out, triage being built here from closing Riverview and moving some vulnerable. I mean, nobody talks about that because nobody knows about that story, but I was there protesting that. So there's so many stories and it's tiring and it's exhausting. And I was really happy to see young people come out for 105 because, I had to move on to other things and my focus is in art, but we need to find ways to sustain the fight with new people coming in, because going back to the same people all the time is exhausting, and you're going to lose them and you lose interest. And we need to find a way to keep that pipeline always filled with people coming through and helping with the work.
Thanks, Barbara, for that. And I maybe as moderator, I'll throw some concluding sort of observations just from listening. Several of you mentioned sort of young people and how young people become involved, and universities. I'm gratified as someone who's in his 50s now that our young students at UBC who helped put together the Chinatown Reimagined website and their perspectives on what Chinatown means. We a comic book about Chinatowns around the world, and I think this idea instead of sustaining the engagement. So, maybe one thing to come out of this panel is Chinatown Reimagined 2, hosted in Montreal, next year. kind of like, for us to come together, and it might be virtually again, but to kind of to keep this up. As I said, I know exactly what you mean, Malcolm. Of sometimes the you think you're alone after a while, or you're that feeling of isolation. So we've recorded the sessions, each of them today as well as tomorrow. So they'll be up in the days ahead. For those of you who have attended, thank you. But also, if you want to share and say, hey, so some really interesting conversations, if you want to share those, the links to the forum sessions will be up on the Chinatown Reimagined website. Again, if I mentioned the 105 Kiefer fight, it's a beautiful film. So there's a number of film clips up about Vancouver Chinatown that were done, some by UBC students, some by Andy Chu for VAF, another set of films about the Chinatown Historical Society buildings that was done by another set of people that should be going up in the days to come. But if you want to watch Clash on Kiefer, that's there's a link to a special preview there. And then we look forward to Karen's film coming out in the near future, we hope. And so maybe that's an excuse to get together again. So I want to thank everyone, again, the panelists for sharing your knowledge, and also your on the ground situated sense of the places that you've come from. And going back to, again, Karen's opening of saying, sometimes it seems business, you don't know what's going on. It superficially looks like they're part of or not part of the China, but it really is that kind of on the ground grassroots that matters. And so thank you everyone for your participation. Again, we hope many of you will be back for tomorrow's sessions. We look forward to again sharing, and my apologies that as a bad moderator, I didn't get a chance to actually bring some of the questions that were shared by audience members and on Slido, but don't worry, those are recorded, and we're going to actually make sure that we continue to discuss the issues that are raised by you as well. So my thanks for everyone again, and from the audience for participating, as as we heard about all these other Chinatowns, and it's a chance to connect up. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And as I said, check out all the things on Chinatown Reimagined, and some of the things that some of our young students have really done a great job of presenting about Vancouver Chinatown. So thanks to everyone.